A warm welcome to you all. Hi, everybody. On this Thursday night, July 4th, I'm Doris Epstein, co-chair of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, CIJR for short. Ugly pro-Hamas anti-Semitism is sweeping our campuses and streets. The Gaza war rages on. Iran is approaching nuclear status. Russia continues to advance in the Ukraine. This upcoming American election will have serious consequences on Israel, on Jews, and the entire world. Join us tonight as CIJR Director and historian Professor Fred Krantz and McGill University Political Science Professor Emeritus Harold Waller discuss America's election and the possible global and domestic implications. First, a big thanks to our community sponsors. The Middle East Forum, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, End Jew Hate Canada, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, the Lodger Center Congregation, Adath Israel Congregation, and the Israel Activist Calendar. Now, a little about CIJR, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. It started about 35 years ago in Montreal. A group of professors headed by Professor Krantz were seeing rampant anti-Semitism on the streets and campuses of Montreal. They began organizing speakers, publications, conferences, anything and everything to fight the misinformation and bias against Israel and the Jewish people. Sound familiar? Has anything changed? I think things have gotten worse. It continues to this very day, and today with even greater urgency. Through CIJR's publications such as the Daily Briefing, you can expect in-depth, fact-based reports on Israel, Jewish culture, and world politics, trustworthy information, and news that you'll never find on any mainstream media. Let me remind you, though, that CIJR is a not-for-profit organization whose work with students and for Israel is entirely dependent on tax-free donations. We're ready to start. Get your questions ready in the chat box. And now over to you, Professor Waller.
Thank you, Doris. What we're going to do this evening is to look at three aspects of the current political situation, and then we'll welcome questions from those who are signed in to the webinar this evening. The first topic will be American domestic politics. Then we'll move on to a discussion about Israel, and finally, the foreign policy dimensions of the American election. So looking at American domestic politics, Fred, I want to ask you, what do you think is at stake in the coming election, and where do the two parties stand on this?
Thank you, Al. Just let me say very briefly to thank Doris and Alan and David for setting up this program and our generous sponsors. We much appreciate their help. I think what we have to say about the domestic situation for openers is we are in severe crisis. American politics is facing a series of issues which are getting worse. In the last few days, of course, we've got the problem of the Biden presidency and whether, in fact, he will continue through the end of this term, let alone whether he will be a candidate for a second term. And that is a grave issue because it poses a kind of question mark over policy stability and a point of weakness in a world which is at great crisis, as was initially pointed out by Doris. Crisis in Ukraine, crisis, of course, in Israel and the Middle East, crisis in Asia with China pushing on Taiwan and pushing on the Philippines, even in Latin America, where China, Russia, and Iran are trying to offset American dominance. So we're looking at a world in flux, very dangerous crisis, and American politics extremely disordered and extremely problematic. So I think I would say that for openers. What do you think, Hal?
Well, I think that the situation is exacerbated by the uncertainty about President Biden. Ironically, this is not the first time that a president the president's capacity to function has been called into question. Let's remember what happened to Woodrow Wilson after his stroke. He spent the last 2 years in the presidential office with his wife and one of his cabinet members running the show, and he was kept under wraps. So right now, we don't even know whether Joe Biden will be the president for the rest of his term, whether he will be a candidate, the selection of the Democratic Party. All these are uncertain elements which make it hard to make any prediction. Nonetheless, we can look at some of the important issues domestically. First of all, each of the two parties has extreme elements. The progressives in the Democratic Party on the left and far-right elements supporting the Republican Party. I think that this is an unfortunate situation. I think American politics functions much better when the two parties move close to the center. One a little bit to the right of center, or the other a little bit to the left of center. But when you move too far off the center, you leave a weak center, and that is an invitation to trouble. Secondly, I'm concerned about the criticisms of the existing political systems, especially the judicial system recently, institutions, Congress in some sense, the presidency in other senses. The party system is not working very well because it is leading partisans on each side to question the legitimacy of what's happening in government when they are not in power. And I think that does not augur well for the future. Thirdly, I think that the attacks on the Supreme Court in particular are very troubling. The Supreme Court needs legitimacy, needs to be recognized as a legitimate arbiter of the Constitution in order for the political system to function properly, and that is open to question right now. And finally, the justice system is being weaponized in a way that is not healthy for the system. So to sum up, I think that the parties have each moved too far away from the center, and that this is a destabilizing force.
I'll comment on that and generally agree. I would point out that what has emerged, and it didn't begin simply 3 years ago, it began quite a great deal earlier. There are two different philosophies of American government which have emerged and embedded themselves in the two parties. One, the Democrats have increasingly moved away from a Republican democracy. The United States, at its founding, was a democratic republic based on the division of powers and the limitation of certain powers, in fact, in the interest of human freedom of the individual. Government was designed to serve the individual and not the other way around. What's happened in the Democratic Party, it has become more and more a kind of plebiscitary democracy led by a leader, a president, who legislates. And Congress, from the point of view of the Democratic presidency, has taken a secondary role. The Republicans still embody, despite the extremism at the right edge, they still embody the notion of the constitutional republic, a democratic republic, limited government. So you have two different philosophies which are in contradiction, really, to one another. And one of the consequences is that the center is weakened, and the center may not hold, as the old poem put it. The center may not hold. Now, a remarkable phenomenon here is Trump, which I'd like to underline at the beginning. He has been president. We have a situation in which I think once before in the history of the American Republic, a president lost an election, came back years later and was reelected. looks like Trump may well be reelected, especially given the divisions in the Democratic Party that we're looking at. He has been attacked by the Democrats, by Biden. You talked about the weaponization of justice. Clearly, this was a politicization of the political process, an attempt to block his candidacy. They went at him in 4 different ways, with Democratic prosecutors and Democratic juries in Democratic constituencies. And now, especially given the recent series of Supreme Court decisions, it looks as if none of those prosecutions will, in fact, be successful. Either they will be turned back before coming to adjudication, or their adjudication will be so postponed that Trump may well be president and in control of the Justice Department by the time they come to court, and he will simply annul them. So it looks as if that gambit, which had a third world quality to it, a banana republic quality, to get at the hated Trump, to block him in any way, to use the agencies of government to do it, to be corrupt, that has been broken. And it's very interesting that I think it's been broken by the Supreme Court. It's been broken by the reassertion of constitutional jurisdiction, constitutional legitimacy. It certainly wasn't broken by the media. The media generally, what are called the regime media, the major media, have played a supine role. They have furthered the attack on Trump. They do not broadcast the news objectively. If all you watched were CNN and NBC and ABC, you would be ill-informed. You really would not know what's going on. Here, the social media, which we critique a lot for its problems, social media has given the citizenry another avenue of information, another way of receiving the truth about what's going on, and that's played a very good role, a countervailing role. But I think what we are looking at here is a crisis in American government, and one of the issues we can discuss is, can Humpty Dumpty be put back together again? If Trump is in fact elected, and it looks like he will be, is he able, with his advisors, to in fact right the ship and to put American economy, American society, American culture back on a kind of steady course? And what is going to become of the two-party system? What will happen to the Democratic Party? Is it going to be reformed as a result of this situation?
Well, I'd like to jump in here and make a couple of points. First of all, I don't share your assurance that Trump is going to win the election. I think the election still has a long way to go. And to be honest, we don't even know for sure who the Democratic candidate will be. So it's not at all clear how the election is going to turn out. But in a broader sense, the questions are being raised by various commentators and people who are committed to one side or the other about the legitimacy of the American system. And I think that is one of the issues that is at stake in this election, because with some exceptions, notably civil war in the 19th century, generally Americans accept the election results and the consequences of those elections. And now we find an increasing willingness by those who are on the losing end of one policy issue or another to raise questions about whether the system has produced an appropriate result. And I think that this reflects a lack of understanding of the system that the framers of the Constitution tried to establish. The easy answer to the question is, how does a democracy work? Is that the majority rules. But the framers, as is very evident from the Federalist Papers, wanted to establish a counter-majoritarian system, a system where the majority would be thwarted in many of its attempted actions. And this was deliberately devised to try to keep politics close to the center. I think that is in jeopardy now. And I think there's a need for a force in American politics that will try to reassert the necessity of building a consensus about basic issues, because that consensus that used to be there, and it was not that long ago, arguably not long before Joe Biden entered the Senate, you could say that that consensus existed. It doesn't exist anymore, and so that is a really severe problem. Finally, I'm concerned about the way that opponents of Donald Trump demonize him, even using the dreaded Nazi word, suggesting that his goal is to establish a dictatorship. Unlike most presidential candidates, we saw him in action 4 years ago, and I don't think there was any sign of an inclination toward a dictatorship. So what has changed to create this fear of him? Similarly, I don't recall seeing the Supreme Court demonized to the extent that it has been lately, since the court packing attempt by FDR back in 1937, when basically FDR wanted to get rid of the entire Supreme Court. And he actually achieved that goal because during his term in office, he appointed all 9 Supreme Court justices. So there's a complete turnover of the court. So I want to ask Fred, how can we get out of the situation where one side demonizes the other? And certainly we find Republicans demonizing the left wing of the Democratic Party. So it's working from both sides, and I think it's a dangerous trend.
Yes, I would agree, but I think the initiative, the push to in fact destabilize the system has come in recent years from the Democratic side principally. Not entirely, but principally. And the demonization of Trump and the use of the courts, the use of the Justice Department to do this has been extremely dangerous and concerning. I think the one thing I'd like to look at here, and partially answering your question, how to proceed and how do we make sure that there is stability? And that stability is crucial for the world, by the way. America is the hegemonic power in the world. And if America is unstable, then the whole world system, which was built up after the Second World War, is threatened. And by the way, that is what the new axis is after. The new axis is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, okay, and Turkey and a number of other states, which are seeking to, in fact, shatter the American hegemony. Those are all dictatorships, whether they're Islamic or secular dictatorships that have a great deal in common. And by the way, they are all nuclear powers, including North Korea. And that is one of the great dangers we are facing. So I would want to look at one element in this, which we should touch on, and that is education. I think part of the destabilization of our country juridically, politically, culturally, is issuing from the radicalization of education, from kindergarten through grade 12, and then, of course, into the colleges and universities. We have seen it. The universities have disgraced themselves in terms of allowing anti-Semitic elements to come to dominance and even control, to redo the syllabi. We no longer have Western civilization focus in our universities. These schools are cranking out, the education colleges have been ideologized, radicalized, socialized, and they're cranking out people who are both ignorant and ideologically aggressive at the same time. We have a kind of peculiar woke thug on campus who walks around talking about, we are Gaza, we are Hamas rather, and from the sea to the river to the sea, not knowing what they're talking about, having the slightest idea of what Hamas really is, but entirely sure because of the brainwashing that the university faculties have given them, that Israel is a genocidal state and that it is Israel and not Hamas and not Hezbollah who precipitated this war. This is absurd and nonsense and simply a matter of vicious ignorance. And until we stabilize that, these are the education institutions are cranking out the people who are manning the media. They're going into politics. This is the future. And we really have to be concerned about this. So one crucial aspect about how we can right the ship, as I put it, is, of course, to deal with reform of education, which is a major problem, a very complex problem, which perhaps we can devote another Zoom seminar to in the near future. The other side of the coin is the way to begin the stabilization is to elect the right people, is to defeat those who would, in fact, turn America into a de facto one-party state, and to manipulate the juridical structures and manipulate the Constitution. After all, it's Biden and his people who are trying to do away with the Electoral College, to pack the court, to do away with the filibuster in the Senate, which is a protection of individual minority rights. Again and again and again, it's Schumer, the head of the Democratic Party in the Senate, who stands in front of the Supreme Court, shaking his fist and threatening the Supreme Court justices with retribution. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's remarkable what we're living through here. And nothing was done about this. Nothing was done about protests against the homes of Supreme Court justices. The Attorney General did nothing, although he was mandated to do so by law. So that has to be turned around. And in my view, you're quite right, Hal. It isn't sure that the Republicans will win. It isn't sure that Trump will be elected. There is a question mark here. One of the problems, however, is for the Democrats, they don't have a bench. They don't have a major candidate. They have very low quality candidates. They have some governors, but they haven't got the kind of lineup that the Republicans have. They don't have, Senator Cotton. They don't have Mike Pompeo. They don't have Vivek Ramaswamy, et cetera, et cetera. They don't have Rubio. If Trump is elected, he will appoint these remarkable people to cabinet. There will be a remarkable, talented, coherent government. And that's the other side of the coin. So the electoral campaign and the electoral victory, I think, comes first. But if that is achieved, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. And we'll get onto it in the next segment, the whole problem of our military and the weakness of our military-industrial complex and the role of the very powerful Chinese buildup on the world stage. So yes, there's much to be done. Nothing is certain.
Well, actually, the next segment involves Israel, and we will get to the foreign policy issues toward the end of our webinar. But the issue of Israel, which I think is central to the work of CIJR, is very complex right now. Looking at it from the American perspective, this war that started with the heinous attack by Hamas on October 7th, what that has done is to work its way through domestic politics. And we find, to an astonishing extent, even for those who were skeptical about how much anti-Israel sentiment was out there, we've been overwhelmed by the amount of protests and embraces of Hamas and calls for Israel's destruction, not to mention the patently absurd accusations of genocide. The very fact that one would even take such an accusation seriously is a reflection, I think, of an underlying bias against Israel. But looking at what's going on in Israel itself right now, I think this war, especially as it has been going on now for many, many months, is that it is, in some senses, threatening to destabilize domestic politics within the country. This is especially true since the Supreme Court held that the traditional exemption of the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox segment of the population from the military draft was no longer compatible with the prevailing fundamental principles of Israeli democracy. And so the prime minister is between a rock, the Supreme Court, and a hard place, the Haredim, who are an integral element of his coalition. Can he maneuver in this environment at least until the fall? And what might happen then? Is an election call imminent? Are there other options involving the coalition? For example, could Netanyahu find a way to redo his coalition in a way which would make him less dependent on the Haredim? I'm dubious about that because he's pretty much burned his bridges with natural coalition partners who are more to the center. So I think there's a serious internal domestic political problem in Israel in creating a government that can complete the job of this war against Hamas and handle the internal problems within Israeli society itself.
Yes, my concern when we come to Israel is not so much the internal domestic policy, which we'll get to. I don't see any alternative to Bibi Netanyahu as an Israeli leader. He is the most experienced and in many ways distinguished and able, and most able to deal with the American situation, I think. And Gantz has left the war cabinet, which I think was a very bad thing to do in the midst of the campaign against Gaza in Rafah. I think that's a terrible mistake. And but I don't think it will lead to the downfall of the government. And one of the things that is remarkable in American policy is the extent to which, after initial support, you may recall, Biden has in fact backed off, and Biden is now, in fact, in many ways undercutting the Israeli campaign against Hamas and weakening Israel. It's very clear that he and his foreign secretary, foreign affairs head, Anthony Blinken, who I think is our current world's Chamberlain, by the way, very, very inept character. They are pushing for a two-state solution after October 7th, when the vast majority of Israelis, 80% in polls, are agreed there shall not be a reimposition of a Palestinian-dominated state. The Israelis will never agree to reconstitute the Palestinian Authority in any form whatsoever, and they're quite right to do so. And we can come back to that if we wish later. But I think the key thing for me about Israel at the moment is the dire state that the country is in terms of its military situation. Israel is fighting an existential war. It's in the 8th month, going into the 9th month of the longest war in its history. And it's fighting this war on a three-front basis: in the south against the Hamas people and their tunnels in Gaza, against the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Palestinians, and in the north against Hezbollah. Hezbollah has fired over 5,000 missiles against Israel in the last couple of months, and the tempo is picking up. There is going to be war in the north. Israel is facing a terrible situation, a two-front war, at least a two-front war. And behind it all, of course, is the octopus. The octopus is Iran and all of these other outfits like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and the militias in Iraq and Syria. They are the tentacles of Iran. And the major thing which I hold against Biden and his administration, and which I cannot understand, it's totally irrational, crazy, is their unerring, unfailing support for Iran in the context of all of this. They continue to fund Iran. They continue to not enforce sanctions so that Iran can sell oil, millions and billions of dollars of oil to the Chinese, cheap oil. Iran is supplying drones and missiles to the Russians. And Biden and company sit back and rattle on about a two-state solution and reviving the Palestinian Authority, all steps which are inimical to Israel's national interest. And one would have thought to the national interest of the United States, since Israel is, on a world scale, the greatest and most reliable democratic ally of the United States. And in the Middle East, Israel has been an invaluable asset for the United States, militarily, politically, technically, you name it. The great work of Yoram Ettinger, the Israeli scholar.
I'd like to interject a point here, Fred.
I would just like to make the point that that's the key concern for me, is that Israel has to, in fact, triumph over this coalition of forces which are out to get it. And they are Islamist forces in the Middle East. They are not placable. You can't reconcile them. They are out to destroy Israel again and again, as Sinwar has said, the leader of the Hamas murderers. If you let him go, he'll come right back at you. So there has to be a decisive decision militarily in that region.
I think you raised a very important point, Fred, namely the tilt of the Biden administration toward Iran. The Biden administration has been much too soft on Iran, much more forthcoming with regard to Iran, and much less hostile to the Iranian regime. But this is not something new. If you look back at the Obama administration,
yes,
for 8 years, that's where this positive orientation toward Iran originated. There was no clear explanation for that when Obama was president. There's no clear explanation for it now, but I find it very peculiar that this has become a feature of the last two Democratic administrations without any explanation as to why it's desirable to build up Iran at the expense of the Sunni Arabs. You can see by looking at the Middle East that many of the Sunni states are fearful of Iran, and there's the possibility, which was brought to light through the Abraham Accords, of the Sunni states finding ways to work with Israel to thwart Iranian ambitions. And that was something that was certainly encouraged during the years that Trump was president. But in the Biden administration, they've gone back to the Obama era policy, and they have allowed Iran to greatly enhance its position in economic, military, technological terms compared to what was the case in the previous administration. And the result has been that a lot of money has become available to Iran, which has been used to outfit organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. And this has all been to the detriment of Israel. So I would hope that somebody could provide an answer or an explanation as to why there is this focus in the current administration on a more open, friendly attitude toward Iran than was the case previously. So I think that's an important point. The other point I wanted to make about Israel is that I see some indications of a shakeup in the party system. I touched a moment ago on problems with the parties of the right. What we've seen just recently in the last few weeks is that two main parties on the left, the Labor Party, which used to be the dominant party in Israeli politics, has now merged with Meretz, which was somewhat more to the left. And this, I think, was a smart move, which will help them as they combine forces in the next election. And the question I would ask is whether we can expect some kind of action on the right as well. For example, will there be a new right of center party that will differ on domestic issues, say from Likud, and which will be in competition with Likud? There could be some major shakeups before the next election. And certainly with the issue of the Haredim, which I mentioned a moment ago, the likelihood of advancing an election date seems greater than it was at the beginning of this year.
Yeah, if I can comment on that, I would like to say a few things. Number one, the Merits labor union, I think, is largely irrelevant because together I think they don't constitute more than 5% of the electorate. They're very tiny, very marginal. I think something much more important is happening in Israeli society. And that is, I take the religious parties more seriously than perhaps you do, Hal, insofar as their political role and their political efficacy is concerned. I think that this war and the unceasing hostility of the Islamic Arabs against Israel and the weakness of the international community, look at what's gone on at the UN. They haven't yet condemned. The United Nations has not yet condemned the Gaza massacre. The head of the UN tilts against Israel repeatedly. The Security Council is impotent because A, of the Russian veto, and B, of American opportunism in that council. Israel cannot count on the international community. It cannot count on the U.S., certainly under Biden. And if Biden is reelected, I think the relation to Israel will get even worse. And therefore, I think one of the things that's happening in Israel is that the Judaic consciousness, awareness of being a Jewish state, the awareness of the millennial history of that state, and of its ultimate need to rely on its own resources. The great work of the Canadian thinker, Emil Fackenheim, comes up in this regard. The great lesson of the Holocaust was that the Jews could rely only on themselves in the long run. And therefore, the rebirth of the state of Israel in 1948 was a great miracle, an act of faith in the Jewish future after the catastrophe of the Holocaust. I think the religious parties are going to play an even greater role in Israeli politics. And I think the secular parties, Likud is a secular party, most of it, and certain centrist elements are going to become more fideistic, more religious, not necessarily overtly Orthodox. But I think there's a vast wave of, call it Jewish nationalism, if you will, of religious vision, religious faith, determination, which is going to be strengthened as a result of this horror that Israel is living and is still living. And I don't see that as a bad thing at all. I see that as a good thing and a natural thing. And the Haredim themselves, more and more of the ultra-Orthodox Haredim are, in fact, going into the military voluntarily. The numbers are going up. That's a very interesting phenomenon. There are whole battalions of the IDF composed of religious soldiers. And it's a remarkable thing to see them in their talesim and praying on Shabbat and laying tefillin on the battlefield. I mean, it's a remarkable phenomenon. And I think it will appeal to Jews in the diaspora as well. And that's another aspect of Jewish life that Emil Fackenheim understood, the impact of Israel on Jewish life in the Jewish world at large. I think we're going to see more of that now, particularly as America becomes less and less reliable, and as anti-Semitism spreads on our campuses and in our streets. We used to think America was unique. America was not like Europe. It couldn't happen here. And there are a lot of people now beginning to worry maybe something like that could happen here. And that is a very worrying dynamic.
Okay, I think we should move on to our third topic now, which is American foreign policy. And I think, Fred, you're going to lead that section.
Yeah, okay, I'll kick this off, Hal, and give it over to you as quickly. The word I'd like to use in terms of international dynamics, the global situation is crisis. Crisis. We are on the edge, if not already into World War III. And this descent into world conflict, possible descent, it's beginning. Maybe we can stop it, but this possible descent is radicalized because all of the powers today are nuclear. In 1914, that wasn't the case. In 1939, that wasn't the case. Can you imagine the Nazis with a nuclear weapon? Iran is on the edge of getting a nuclear bomb. They evidently, according to the International Atomic Energy Association, they already have enough fissionable material to make 3 to 4 bombs. And they have the missiles, which they've already demonstrated in their shower of missiles against Israel, which was thankfully blunted by Israel and by some allied help. So we're looking at a terrible situation, and we have to understand that the Hamas, Israel, Hezbollah, Israel, Iran conflict is embedded in the larger conflict. It's a conflict of a new axis, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and their associates, which are vying for world dominance with the United States. And when I look at it, I'm an historian, and when I look at the current situation we're in, it reminds me of 1938, 38, 39. And I'll lay it out for you very quickly. These are analogies, and they don't hold completely, and there are many differences, but in large scale, it's quite frightening. In a way, China represents what Japan was in 38, 39. Russia is Germany. Russia has invaded another European state, Ukraine. Ukraine is Czechoslovakia, you might say, which was finally sacrificed by France and Britain under Chamberlain. And what is Israel in this scenario? Israel is Poland. Poland hung in the balance. Poland had alliances, but in 1939, Poland went down without the Allies intervening. 1939, and Hitler became predominant. And if you look at the US, just to round it out, the US in many ways today is what it was in 1938, 39. We forget that although FDR was president, the United States was an isolationist country. And the vast sentiment politically was not to get involved in Europe, despite FDR's efforts. And when it came to domestic violence, they didn't have Hamas then. The Islamic world was still asleep. It didn't have any bearing on the United States at that point. But we had the German-American Bund, which people should remember. We had Nazis in the streets and on campuses. There have been books written about the favorable view of fascism on the one hand, Italian fascism, and Nazism on the other. And you had these vast meetings in Madison Square Garden in New York of the American Nazi Party, right on the eve of the war, right down to December 7th, 1941. So the analogy is there. There are, of course, real differences. We hope that NATO will be a stronger entity than it has been, and it is there to protect Europe and is an American ally. And but the Chinese are pressing on Taiwan. The Chinese are pressing on the Philippines. They have been pressuring Philippine boats in the Philippine Sea around islands that the Chinese want. They have vast exercises, military exercises taking place against Taiwan. Russia continues to press on Ukraine and to threaten nuclear actions if things don't go the Russian way. North Korea has just made an alliance with the Russians. The North Koreans are providing ammunition, bombs, and other weapons, and the Russians are providing satellite techniques and missile technology to the nuclear-equipped North Koreans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even Turkey, which is in NATO and which has the second largest army in NATO, Turkey under Erdogan is increasingly Islamist. And Turkey plays a great role in providing drones to the Russians and technical equipment and IT stuff. So we're looking at a very, very serious situation in the world globally, and it is being made, I'll try and stop here for a moment, give you a chance, Hal, but I would just want to say it is being worsened by what I call the interregnum. There is emerging an interregnum in American politics. The state under the Biden administration, which was weak, is going to be weaker, if anything. Any way it goes. There's a rising chorus now among the Democratic powers that be and even now the media to dump Biden. They see a catastrophe coming. They see an electoral wave that might swamp them over. They want someone else. So even if they dump Biden, the person they get is going to have a very short time to assert himself or herself. And the group of people that is possible, the papabiles, right, the people who are electable, is relatively small and not very distinguished. So there's an interregnum, and you can be sure that Chairman Xi in China and Putin and the leader of North Korea and Khomeini in Iran are licking their chops and looking at this situation. And you've heard the rumors that there is some kind of big thing coming in Europe, a series of terrorist attacks on American military installations. That may be part of it. And another part of it may be all of the illegal immigrants coming in at the southern border, the open southern border. That's another aspect of Biden's horrible, terrible policy, which include a certain percentage of terrorists. Clearly, everybody, the head of the FBI, Wray, has pointed this out repeatedly. There's going to be a terrorist incident in the United States alongside the various murders and rapes which are already taking place. So I see the next 6 months as extremely dangerous. And I just pray that we will get through to it without a terrible incident that will plunge us into a wider war.
I agree that this is a really serious situation. And what it illustrates is why the situation has been allowed to deteriorate. What prevents the deterioration of this kind of situation is the effectiveness of deterrence. American policymakers and scholars, as well as their counterparts on the Russian side, have been aware of this ever since the two sides both had nuclear weapons by the 1950s, the early 1950s. The question is whether the US policy as it currently exists is sufficient to deter possible enemies. And I would argue that it is not. The perception that I think many on the outside have is that the focus has shifted toward domestic politics and the necessity of maintaining a strong deterrent against possible aggression from the kinds of forces that Fred has just described, I think is not effective anymore. So I think that one of the primary challenges to anyone who wants to become president in the coming election is how are you going to restore American deterrence? And this is not simply a matter of saying, well, we have a different policy than the previous administration, or we've had a revelation and we figured out what we have to do. It also involves commitments, including financial commitments, at a time when the budget is squeezed. The budget is $2 trillion annually in deficit. The cost of financing the accumulated debt now exceeds the amount of money which is allocated in the budget to the Defense Department. And the result is that it's not clear that the US is in a position to deter potential enemies on all the fronts in which they might act. So I think that will become a primary objective of whatever party is going to have the presidency after this election. In the meantime, it's 6 more months until the new president takes office. And we're at a stage where I think deterrence is weakened and the US and the international system are very vulnerable to possible aggression from people with malevolent objectives. So I think there needs to be a recognition among policymakers of the urgency of this situation, but I don't find that recognition to be present.
I agree. Well, I think it is present on the Republican side. I think that it's very clear that people like Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of Defense, Mike Waltz in Congress, there are a whole series of very informed figures on the Republican side who are pointing to the vast deficit in American military preparation. Our military industrial complex has been allowed to wind down. The Chinese, let me give you a few examples quickly. The Chinese have over 20 shipbuilding facilities, shipyards, capable of building military, naval military vessels. The Chinese are working now on their 4th aircraft carrier. The United States very slowly cranks out 1 aircraft carrier, maybe every 2-3 years, if they're lucky. We can't, in fact, service our nuclear submarines, which are the key element in our fleet. They can't service them. They don't have the shipyards that can service these ships. They're going without being serviced and refurbished. The Chinese are cranking out submarines. Why, by the way, you might ask? And military strategy, military facts, military considerations are crucial. Why are the Chinese, who are a great land power, they're an Asian land power, why are they building aircraft carriers? Aircraft carriers are used by navies to project their power internationally, okay? So you can begin to think about that. Why are the Chinese building up bases across Africa? Why are they interested in Latin America? Why did 5 Russian ships, including a nuclear-powered submarine with presumably nuclear missiles aboard, recently spend a week in Cuban harbors? They're now in Venezuela, by the way. Okay, shades of what was it? The Cuban Missile Crisis. Russian planes, Russian technology is pretty sharp. They're lending it to the North Koreans. They're lending it to the Iranians. We can't even produce enough ammunition for our own purposes. We can't supply the Ukrainians with ammo. The Ukrainians are desperately trying to find artillery shells anywhere they can, Czechoslovakia, Serbia, whatever, wherever they can get it. The Americans have to rebuild. The tremendous work of reconstruction that has to go on by a new administration, military reconstruction, political reconstruction, cultural reconstruction, economic reconstruction. It's a tremendous task, and we're racing against time. Our enemies are out there. The new Axis is watching. And again, I just fear a Sarajevo, that sparked World War I, or an invasion of Poland that sparked World War II, that occurs before we're ready, before America is ready. We are facing a real crisis, and Israel is part of that crisis. America has been the only country in the world that Israel could rely upon. And by the way, that's not true any longer in the same way. Okay, the next 6 months are therefore crucial. Just keep your fingers crossed and pick up your Sephorim and pray. This is a difficult and worsening situation in many ways. I'm looking forward to what Netanyahu is going to do and say when he comes here in a few, not that long from now, to address Congress. That's going to be a remarkable and dramatic moment, I think.
Okay, I think we've covered most of the big issues that are on the table, and therefore I'd like to turn things over to Doris to organize the question period.
Thank you both. We're ready for questions, and there's a ton of it. Let's go back to the elections first. Would there be a difference in outcome if Biden, if Michelle Obama or Gavin Newsom or somebody else would be on the ticket rather than Biden? Would there be a different outcome, do you think?
Okay, I'll jump in. I don't think there would be. I think the Democratic Party has made a decisive shift in terms of its orientation with regard to foreign policy. And I don't see that any of the named potential Democratic candidates is talking about reversing direction of foreign and military policy. So if a Democratic candidate wins, I would not expect a major shift in policy. If Trump wins, there would be a shift. It's not clear how far it would go. but there would be a different orientation.
Yeah, I would generally on political matters, political party matters, I defer to my friend and colleague Hal Waller, who's the political scientist and the expert. I would only add to that I think there is one Democratic candidate who's interesting, and ironically, that's Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania, who is a new governor. He's moderate, quite capable, and of course Jewish. It would be a great irony to have the Democratic Party somehow or other reformed and led by a Jewish candidate and potentially a Jewish president. But I don't think it will come to that. My sense is that Trump, unless something terrible happens, which I greatly fear, but I hope not, but unless that Trump is going to, that he will emerge from the legal cases unscathed and on a wave of popular support, turning against the Democrats, and particularly if there's a crisis in Europe or Asia, that will lend itself not to Biden or his successor, but to the Republican candidate. Trump is a pair of careful hands. You can trust him. You may not like him. You may not like his personality. You may not like his past, but he was president for 4 years. He's the greatest, most favorable president to Israel has ever had. He set back the Iranians. He broke with the Palestinians. He came out against the Palestinian state. He said that Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria was legitimate, and in the Golan. He brought the capital of Israel back to Jerusalem. For goodness sake, that is the most positive record and courageous record of any president in American history. And the country as a whole was in good shape before the pandemic hit. The economy was great. Inflation was down. Employment was up. Different groups like women and blacks and Hispanics were employed at highest levels of employment. And we can hope that that can be reconstituted fairly rapidly, especially given the kind of cabinet that he can put in place. So I must say, it's important to be objective and to look at both sides of the issue. And Hal is extremely correct in terms of hoping that somehow or other the middle can be reasserted. And we can get back to the old days where the Dems and the Republicans were known as Tweedledum and Tweedledee. We didn't know how lucky we were at that time.
It was boring then.
Boring is okay. Nothing wrong with being bored. May you have an interesting life is an old curse. But I think there's a great work of reconstruction that goes into the next administration, and I hope it will be in Republican hands. That's essentially what I want to say on this issue. I would, by the way, I would make one point. We haven't mentioned Canada. I would just like to mention Canada en passant, that much of what we're talking about here, I think it's true of Canada as well, that the Conservatives are equivalent to the Republicans, and that the Liberals and the NDP, Trudeau and Singh, are equivalent to Biden and company. And there is a Canadian election which will be coming up in about less than a year now, and all the polls are indicating that the Conservatives will win that election, so that Canada too will be brought back onto proper beam. Canada has been as worse than the United States in relation to Israel and the Palestinian issue. So that's long overdue. Just wanted to say that.
This is coming from several people. Why does the Biden administration continue to push the idea of a two-state solution?
Well, I'll jump in here. I'm frankly appalled that the idea of a two-state solution was resurrected at the very time that Hamas perpetrated this sneak attack on Israel on October 7th. This was no time to suggest that. It was totally inappropriate. It's rewarding Palestinians for Hamas's aggression. And it's inexplicable to me why all of a sudden this became a very popular response from a number of people internationally and very prominently on the American scene. Any reading of what's going on in Israel, as Fred says, indicates that, if anything, the opposition to the idea of an independent Palestinian state has shrunk greatly as a result of this Hamas war in the last many months. So I think that it's been a grave mistake of policymakers such as the Secretary of State Blinken, the National Security Advisor Sullivan, the President Biden, for all of these people in this environment to bring up the idea of Palestinian statehood. If anything, the Hamas attack on October 7th should be setting back the Palestinian cause in terms of statehood by at least a generation. The whole idea needs to be shelved for at least a generation, and it's extremely irresponsible for policymakers to be bringing that up right now.
Yes, I think the two-state solution there are two elements that go into understanding why it has the hold that it has on some people in some countries. One is there's a false kind of equity involved, that, you know, the poor Palestinians, they've suffered, the Jews have suffered. So the answer is to be 50-50, to be, you know, equal in handling both, and to give the Palestinians a state. The Israelis have a state, and if they have their state, they will be satisfied. The flaw in that, the grave flaw, the fatal flaw, is that in fact the Palestinians do not want a state. They've never wanted a state. What they have wanted, they've never wanted two states. They've wanted one state. Two states are not acceptable because two states mean that the Jewish state will continue to exist. And we have to understand that the Arabs, for the most part, particularly the radicals, the Islamists, but not only, they do not see a Jewish state as viable. This is rooted in religion, is rooted in Islam, and we should notice this. It's time we said it. The Quran looks at the Jews as an inferior people. It will extend at most to them toleration, and on a very secondary level. So the two-state solution was a political tool used by the Arab world, by Arab states, against Israel, number one. And I think that's a very important point to make. I guess I'll leave it. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I'm going to read this. One of our viewers is concerned about the isolationist tendency in the Republican Party. And she's asking, if Trump is elected, what would the policy look like vis-a-vis Israel? What would his policy be? What's your guess?
Like, if I can I respond to that?
Yes.
If she wants to know what his policy towards Israel would be, let her look at his let her look at his 4-year presidency, right?
Do you think it would continue?
Of course it will continue. Trump is a very pro-Israel figure. He will slap sanctions back on Iran, right? He will support Israel. He will, I think, put pressure on the European powers to be more forthcoming in supporting Israel and ceasing their support for the Palestinians. No doubt about it. It's absolutely undoubtable. There is an isolationist fraction to the right of the Republican Party. Particularly, we see it in relation to Ukraine. They don't like the amount of money that's being spent on Ukraine, which I think is foolish, because the Ukraine war is crucial. It is crucial that, it's crucial that Russia be defeated. But then, by the way, defeat doesn't mean that a Ukrainian army will march across Red Square with its band blaring and its blue and yellow banners flying. Defeat means that Russia will not be able to scoop up, to engulf all of Ukraine. There may be a Stillstand peace, a de facto peace. I think that's what Trump has in mind when he says he can make peace the day after he's elected. I think what he has in mind is something like, okay, Russia, if you persist, we'll really give them the weapons that will crush you. So come to the table. Maybe we'll give you a piece of the Donbass. You give them back Crimea, and we've got a peace. And if not, you will lose the war. So I think that's an element, plus element on the side of Trump. But I don't think that small sort of survival of an earlier Republican party, the Taft Party, the Party of American Isolation, is at all normative for the party, and certainly not for Trump himself. So I think our questioner should be reassured on that score.
I'd like
Just
to,
briefly,
I'd like to ask the same question to you, Professor Waller.
yeah,
What's
just
Trump's
briefly,
policy?
I just briefly, I think that there are isolationist elements in the Republican Party. I do not think they are dominant in a Trump-led party. And if you look at the kinds of people that he surrounds himself with to get advice on foreign policy and national defense, I think I would be reassured that these would be people who would pursue a vigorous foreign policy.
Okay, let's go further abroad. How might the elections in the UK, in Europe, how might they affect us here in the United States and Canada? Some UK is going to the left, Germany is going more to the right. How might that affect us here? Or would it?
I think that the elections that are taking place this week in Britain and France are quite significant for those countries. But I don't think that there's going to be a lot of spillover into the American electoral contest. Definitely Britain is going to the left, France is going to the right, and I think that each of those changes reflects things that are going on within those particular countries. And so I think the US voters are going to decide on their own concerns, not on how things are perceived in Europe. And in particular, I think American voters are concerned primarily about the economy, about the border, about crime, and these are all domestic issues. Now, should there be greater concern among voters for international issues? Yes, there should be, but generally speaking, we don't find that those concerns play a big role in presidential elections unless there's some overriding international event that's going on. So right now, I think that the American election will be fought over the familiar issues that we have been discussing.
I would agree. I would want to point out that even in the peculiar British case, which I'll come to in a moment, there has been in the last year or more a decided center-right swing in European politics. That's obviously the case in France, where the right-wing party is won the first round in the French double level elections. It's certainly true in the European Union elections, which took place recently, where right-wing parties came up with marked increases in their vote in the different European countries. It's certainly true in Italy, which has had a right-wing government for the last year or so, year and a half, under the very interesting woman, Milone. So even in Britain, it's interesting because the swing to the left is largely a function of the remarkable incapacity of the Tory government, of the Conservative government, which has had a series of fumbling prime ministers, which has not succeeded in policy, clarity. And one of the things that's happening in Britain is you're getting the emergence of the so-called Reform Party under Farage. Farage is the most interesting figure. He's the guy who led the Brexit campaign and pulled the Conservative Party unwillingly into supporting Brexit. He has enlarged his popularity and looks like he will enlarge his vote. And he may, in fact, breathe a new life into the Conservative Party. So what's going on in Britain, temporarily, there will be a Labour government, and it will be left-wing, more center-left, certainly. And a wing of that party, you remember, goes back to the anti-Semite leader, whose name escapes me at the moment, but who was dismissed in favor of Starmer, the current leader of Labor. So there is, in a way, it's peculiar. I don't think it impinges greatly on what happens in America, but there is a right-wing, center right-wing shift going on in the world. Now, I would be careful about what's going on in France, for instance, because that party that's coming out under Marine Le Pen, under her father, that was a neo-fascist party and very anti-Semitic. And there still are elements of that in that party. But the centrist party under Macron and the leftist party under Mélenchon, they have been extremely anti-Israel. The left-wing party particularly, which is a kind of communist party. It's the descendant of the old French Communist Party. So the French politics has been very negative in relationship to Israel. And as we know, there are terrible instances of anti-Semitic hatred and crime going on in France at this very moment, and to some extent in Germany. Those countries have been invaded by millions of Muslims, Islamic immigrants, who don't assimilate. And that poses a great problem in the European Union and in the European countries. It's interesting. We have a large immigrant Muslim population, but predominantly because of our continental situation, the immigrants to the United States are coming from Latin America. So they tend not to be the Muslim, they tend to be Christian or neo-Christian or secular. And it creates a different dynamic. Although part of what's going on with Biden is that he's concerned about a swing state, Minnesota, where you have a large Muslim population, or Michigan, Dearborn, Michigan. And he's playing to that. That's part of what's going on with his moving away from Israel, his critical attitude towards Israel, that he's playing up to the Muslim population in swing states, which he knows are crucial to his reelection, if he were to ever wind up being the nominee. Okay, so it's complicated.
But this is for both of you. I'd like both your response on this. Are you concerned about the growing, quote, progressive, unquote, wing of the Democratic Party?
Yes, I am. I mean, I think that, as I said earlier, it's very bad for political parties to move too far from the center. And I believe the Democratic Party has done that, and that is detrimental to the health of the political system. I think that the more centrist elements in the party have to rein in the progressives, as they're now called, or the party risks becoming too much of a leftist party. And I think that in the long run, that's not going to be successful in the US. So yes, I think it is a matter of great concern.
And
Yeah,
Professor Krantz.
I would second that. And I wouldn't pussyfoot around the terminology. The Democratic Party, in large part, has become not simply progressive or not simply ultra-liberal, it's socialist. There are Marxist elements which have come to dominance in sectors of that party, particularly the Squad, but not only. That Democratic Party in many ways looks like a Soviet party. It's strange. They have this incredible party discipline. Nobody breaks the discipline. There's a large Jewish component in that party of representatives, congressmen and senators, and they have not come out against the Biden policy on Israel. Far from it. You had Schumer, the Senate leader, in fact, calling for the removal of Netanyahu, an American leader, called for the removal of a democratically elected Israeli prime minister. Very remarkable. Now I think the dam may break because of the wave of panic over Biden and his debate performance and the clear evidence that he has got some kind of mental, emotional blockage. He can't go on. He can't think clearly. He doesn't know where he is. Something has to be done. And people are beginning to sauve qui peut. You begin to worry, he will take us down. We'll lose our position. Many people are up for re-election. They're beginning to realize that there's a direct threat to their individual well-being. So you may find, I think there's a possibility that the Democratic Party may break up. That happens to political parties. The stress of external and internal factors, internal divisions breaks them up. I think the defeat of Bowman in Queens, in New York, one of the squad members, the black socialist anti-Israel pro-Hamas figure, Bowman, he was defeated by a moderate Democrat. That's important. That's a straw in the wind. And there were other squad people. They're all pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian. They're anti-American, these people. They see America as the professors do, the radical professors in the universities. It's America which is evil and responsible for the ills of the world. These are the us versus them people, you know, the oppressors and the oppressed. Uh, they can be smashed as a result of what's coming. So you may find that the Democratic Party undergoes a period of crisis and reformation and recreation. And that may be key to reestablishing the balance that Hal Waller quite rightly sees as necessary and hopes for.
This overlaps kind of with the next question. How would you characterize the differences between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party?
Okay, you want this on one foot, as we say?
Give it a shot.
Yeah. I think that as they exist now, the Republican Party clearly is oriented more toward individuals rather than the collectivity. It is more open to religion in public life. I think that Republicans definitely are committed to capitalist political system, which means trying to reduce government intervention in the economy. And we saw some of that reflected in recent Supreme Court decisions that were handed down in the last week or two. I think that the mainstream of the Republican Party is internationalist, as I indicated earlier, although there are elements that are clearly opposed to that. I think the Republicans also include racist elements, but I believe that those elements are largely kept in check by the mainstream of the party. The Democratic Party is much more oriented toward using government power to achieve their ends, whereas the Republicans believe much more strongly in the free enterprise system. So the Democrats are going to have more policies providing help to individuals in financial terms, more government intervention in the economy, even at the expense of spending money on projects which don't go very far. And I think that the Democrats will depart from what have been important principles of American foreign policy, and will probably have a somewhat weaker orientation towards the kinds of threats that the free world faces overseas, as we've discussed earlier this evening.
Yes,
Professor Krantz, would you add to that?
I would add, it's July 4th, everybody. So we're celebrating American Independence Day.
We are.
Here. And in that spirit, I would like to go back to the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, written by Jefferson, says that the new United States will be devoted to the protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, being able to live your life as you wish it, well, without obstruction, so long as you respect others. Liberty, your freedom, your independence, your lack of being unwarrantedly constrained, but above all, happiness. I think the happiness is crucial. The American Constitution says we want our people to be happy, to have a full life. That happiness is rooted in the Hebrew Bible, by the way. It's rooted in the Decalogue. It's rooted in the Ten Commandments. It's rooted in the notion of protecting the weak and the widows and the orphans, and of respecting one another and living according to the mandates of the divine being who has created man and put him in this world in order for man to be happy, in order for man to live well. It is a good world, says the Lord in the Bereshit, in the beginning, and the very last day of creation, on the sixth, before resting on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath, God creates man. And in that phrase, he looks at man and he says, and this is very good. The rest of creation is good. Man is very good. Man is placed in this world to be human, to live in fidelity with one another, to raise families, to be happy. Everybody wishes to be happy, of course. And not only Jews, Hebrews wrote about happiness, but Aristotle and the Greeks wrote about happiness. The American founding creates a structure through the Constitution which maximizes human liberty. We should remember that. It tries to have the minimal of government, not the maximal. But I think that what's happened is, to pick up on Hal's point, the Democrats over time have become the party of big government, of the state with a capital S, of executive orders, of majorities, with relatively little concern for minorities. The Republicans are truer to the original founders, I think, in terms of the constitutional limits, the division of powers, and the role of the state being minimal, and no one power being able to overwhelm the others. All of that in the interest of individual liberty and freedom. So I think that's the direction we have to go. That's the direction we came from. That's the direction we have to go back to. And of the two parties, I think on balance, the Republican Party represents those values more clearly and more consistently, and particularly insofar as the grave crisis we are facing domestically and internationally is concerned.
This next question applies to both parties. It's about the status of the presidency. The Supreme Court just ruled that presidents, even former presidents, are immune from prosecution for their official acts. They're not to be, in other words, they're not to be held legally responsible for any use of official power, no matter how nefarious. Does this undermine accountability and put the president above the law?
I'm not sure that you're interpreting it the way that I would. I think that a president cannot pull out a gun and shoot somebody in the Oval Office and say, this was part of my official duties. There are clear limits on what is acceptable. What I think the Supreme Court was driving at here was that they did not want a situation where presidents were going to be harassed by legal authorities over activities that they carried out in pursuit of their duties as president. Now, some of the issues, as in Donald Trump's case, may be somewhat on the margin, and so there is room for interpretation, but I do not believe that the decision of the court gives the president a carte blanche to do whatever he or she wants while in the presidency.
Would you agree with that decision, with that ruling? Would you agree with it?
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that ruling. I think that under the circumstances, it made sense. We'll have to see how it plays out in the years to come. But right now, I think that there's a danger of harassment of presidents by political opponents over various things that they do while president. Now, this decision may result in erring on the side of being too permissive of the presidents. And if that turns out to be the case, then I think there will be a correction down the road. But basically, I think the important thing to point out here is that the court said that in pursuit of the president's constitutional duties, there can be no questioning by the criminal courts. In terms of official duties, and these definitions may have to be worked out, in terms of official duties, there's a presumption that the president is permitted, but that can be questioned. If it's not something which is an official duty, then the president has no protection. And I think that the court had struggled to find a formula to fit the real world challenge that it was presented with. And I think it did a reasonable job in coming up with a guide to future judgment of presidents.
Professor Krantz, would you
Yes,
agree?
yeah, I would agree. I think there was absolutely nothing new in the court's decision. The notion that a president in his official capacity, his public capacity, cannot be taken to law is a very old notion in American jurisprudence, but not only in American jurisprudence, in Western jurisprudence. One of the most ancient principles of English law, which fed into the common law on which the thinking of the colonists was based. I mean, the people that wrote the Constitution were Englishmen, and they were completely familiar with the English public law. And that principle is an old ancient one. In Latin, it's called princeps legibus solutus. That is that the prince is free of the law. The prince is sovereignty, is the source of sovereignty. And as the source of sovereignty, it is the prince who, in fact, creates law and is the power behind law. So the prince is, in English law, the king, finally, was not subject to parliamentary rule or decree initially, but he was subject to his own conscience and to God's discipline, of course. So that is an old idea, and there are many, examples of this across English law and in Hebrew law and Jewish law. I mean, who is going to tell Moshe Rabbeinu that he couldn't do what he wanted to do? Was somebody going to stand up and say, no, you don't have the right to lead the people out of Egypt? He had sovereignty. And when kings were established in Israel, those kings were absolute. They were sovereign. But they were bound by Torah. The king had to read Torah. The king could not transgress Torah. And the president can't transgress ordinary civil law, criminal law, when it comes to his individual actions, not as president, but as Trump or as Obama. Remember, Obama used the power of office to assassinate an American citizen who was a terrorist. He had him wiped out with a rocket. And in fact, the Supreme Court decision, which pertains to Trump, pertains also to Obama. You can't go after Obama. A lower court can't now go after Obama for murder because he killed an American citizen. He was acting as president in his public capacity. If that were not true, we couldn't have government. There would be no ability to act. If every Tom, Dick, and Harry, every two-bit prosecutor like these characters in Georgia, the lovers, the prosecutor and her lawyer, could go after presidents, we would be anarchy for everything they do. So the irony is that while the Democrats are huffing and puffing about this law and coming up with absurd notions and theories which have no relevance whatsoever, the person who is really protected here is Biden. Biden, who may well be corrupt through his son. It's an issue we haven't touched on. But millions and millions of dollars have been funneled into the Biden family through Hunter using his father's influence. But the new ruling probably protects Biden from being prosecuted after he leaves office, because any acts he committed as president. So it's an irony here, which they're not yet aware of, but probably will become so.
I think, thank you for that. Let me go to the next one, and I'm trying to collapse two questions. What major issues does the United States face globally? And is their role as a leader in the world being threatened?
Okay, I'll try to answer that first. Clearly, America's role as a world leader is threatened insofar as American leadership is unable to achieve its foreign policy goals. And I think that the US's ability to do that has been diminished in recent years. So I think that this has created an opportunity, created a vacuum that competitive powers can move into. And so the world is not the unipolar system that it was, say, after the fall of the Soviet Union. We're now back into a multipolar system where the US is unable to dominate the other powers and must compete with the other powers, notably Russia, China, Iran, I mean, the countries that Fred identified earlier. So that, I think, is part of the reality. The challenge of American foreign policy today is to reassert American primacy in world leadership. And what was the first part of the question? Could you repeat that, please?
What are the major problems that globally that the United States is facing?
Yeah, the major problems come from that analysis, namely the necessity of containing powers that are committed to upending the status quo, to changing the nature of the global system. And so that, I think, is a major problem. And it's difficult to do so because in order to succeed, you have to have a strong military. And there are domestic forces that are militating against providing the resources to the Defense Department to have the strong and effective military that is now needed. The situation has changed in the past 30 years where American dominance was on question. Now it is being challenged by a number of revisionist powers. And the question is whether the US and its leadership is up to meeting those challenges.
Fred, Professor Krantz, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I have a one-word answer to that which concerns America in the world globally. China, China, China. We are confronting an expansionist power, a very immensely powerful state, an authoritarian state, a communist state. It is expanding, it is industrially developing, it is vying for dominance with the United States. We have to get our act together. China supports Russia, China supports Iran, China will ultimately work with North Korea, which is very close to it on the border. China is the aggressor. It occurs again and again in world history. Forgive me, I'm an historian, so I think in terms of precedents. But you have the Peloponnesian Wars, in which a land power, Sparta, moved against a sea power, Athens. Persia had been defeated prior by the Greeks, then the Greeks turned on themselves. Then you had the whole problem of the First World War, in which the Germans sought to dominate Europe, and through Europe, the colonial world. And Europe had to respond. You have stimulus and response, aggression and response. Second World War, similarly. We're facing it again. It's somehow or other built into the human being, into human nature. And there's a kind of continuous ratio of aggression, stimulus, response. We are called upon as the greatest democracy and the greatest world power and the guarantor of world order to defend that order. That doesn't mean we drop nuclear weapons immediately on China, God forbid, but it means we take every possible step to block China. We created China. We admitted China into the world economy. We were very foolish in many ways. We hoped that the Chinese would develop into a democratic capitalist state. It hasn't happened. Didn't happen in Russia, sadly. It almost happened after Gorbachev. China is the major problem, and we have to prevent China from.
Hey, I'm going to interrupt because we're running out of time.
Can I say something? If we're running out of I'll give you the final question, then give me one final statement, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
What do you think the world Israel, the United States. What do you think it will all look like in 2028?
Well, I'll give Hal a break and I'll take that question. Of course, he can come back on it. I think it's an interesting question. It's a what if question. The book of the future, is the hardest book to read because it hasn't yet been written. And nevertheless, it's interesting to speculate. What happens if I think the American election is decisive in this regard? Because I think, as your audience probably already realizes, I think that a Republican victory is to be preferred. A Trump victory is to be preferred. And if there is such a victory, then the possibility that we can right the ship, we can get the industrial military economy going again, we can adjust the economy, we can deal with inflation, we can close up the border, we can support constitutionalism in its different guises. That's all possible. That all becomes possible, attainable. A big start can be made on it in those 4 years. But notice, Trump can only serve 4 years, right? Even if he's as wonderful as he was first time around in terms of his policies, he's only got 4 years. So the speculation will be on after year 1 as to whom will replace him. And that will be next year's Zoom seminar.
Okay, let's go to
CIJR.
Professor
But
Waller with
if
this.
the Democrats win, I think we're in deep trouble because I think they're going to have a compromised president, whoever gets the nomination, whether it's Biden, which I highly doubt at this point, or some other relatively unknown figure. They're going to be the same old party, the same policy with a very weak leader, and that doesn't move the needle. That doesn't begin to right the ship.
Okay, Professor Waller, last words.
Well, I'll give a short answer to your question about 2028. It depends what happens between now and then.
That's short, all right. Well, let's not leave without wishing America happy birthday.
Good. Can I say one last thing?
Yes.
I want to talk to our audience. Please, audience, if you found this seminar useful, interesting, enlightening, even disturbing, or makes you think, or makes you angry, it's okay. But if you found it useful, please help CIJR, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. We are entirely dependent on individual contributions. We are not supported by any organized structure, by any government. We depend on you. Make a donation. We'll send you a tax-free certificate. Please help us continue to do our work for Israel, for our students, and for our community.
Professor Waller, Professor Krantz,